In our last video, we talked about the beginning of the Great Crusade, the reuniting of the Primarchs with the Emperor and their legions, and the triumph of Ulanor. The Great Crusade had a hopeful beginning, but it would be cut short by a series of betrayals and a civil war that was called the Horus Heresy. Hello everyone, I am Inquisitor Vaughn and I make deep dive videos going into the lore of the 40k universe. If that's something that you're into, please like and subscribe for more content. In this video, we are going to talk about why the Horus Heresy happened, as well as go over some key points in its lore. Without further delay, let's get into it. While on his travels during the Unification Wars on Terra, the Emperor of Mankind would find a machine, a strange relic of the Dark Age of technology in the Asiatic dust fields. It was a complex and psychically receptive piece of technology that the Emperor would store away in the Proto-Imperial Palace that was stationed in the Himalayan mountains. Unsure of its origin or who created it, he knew that it would have value to the future Imperium that he was trying to make. The Emperor was always looking for more stable ways for humanity to dominate the galaxy. Over the eras of humanity, expansion into space was slow and relied on the advances of technology as well as genetic modification. Even with the knowledge of Mars, the ships of Jupiter and Saturn, and the creation of navigators in order for humanity to take advantage of warp travel, expansion was still relatively slow and dangerous. It is specifically unknown when the Emperor discovered the Webway, which was an ancient psychic labyrinth created by the primordial Old Ones in the time before humanity. It's theorized that it was discovered sometime during the Great Crusade by one of the expeditionary fleets. Either way, this was valuable knowledge and it provided an alternative to the dangers of warp travel because the Webway was separate from the warp. Fast forward to the Great Crusade. The Ulanor campaign was a success, the greatest victory of the Great Crusade, a cause for celebration and renewed vigor. But it was also at the triumph of Ulanor that the Emperor announced that he would retire from the Great Crusade. He shared with those in attendance that he would return to Terra to continue his works. In his place, he would leave the Primarch Horus Lupercal as War Master of the Imperial fleets and commander of the Great Crusade. Though the Emperor's decision was met with mixed emotions from the Primarchs, they accepted his decree. Horus Lupercal, Primarch of the Luna Wolves, was made War Master and the Emperor returned to Terra. The Emperor returned to Terra to work on his Webway project, using the Golden Throne device to connect to the Webway from Terra. He told no one about this project except for the Custodes and Malkador. His secrecy around what he was doing on Terra, even from his favored son Horus, would be a foundation for the end of the Great Crusade. When the Emperor disengaged from the Great Crusade and placed Horus Lupercal into the position of War Master, things began to destabilize. If the presence of the Primarchs helped stabilize the Space Marines, then the presence of the Emperor helped stabilize the Primarchs, or at least it kept them in check and going along with the program of the Great Crusade. Many of the Primarchs had harsh upbringings that warped their natures into dark, foreboding aspects, and when they were given leadership of their legions, what the Emperor intended for them was replaced by what the Primarchs learned from the cultures of the worlds that they landed on. This is one of the things that caused a faltering in the foundations of the Great Crusade, the deviation from the imperial standard. When the Emperor returned to Terra, many of the Primarchs began to descend down dark paths, taking their legions with them. Angron and his world leaders would lead bloody campaigns of subjugation, transforming from a legion of disciplined warriors to nothing more than pain-driven barbarians due to the butcher's nail devices that were wired into their nervous system. The Night Lords would continue to weaponize fear, but for the sake of fear itself and the will of their increasingly mad Primarch, Conrad Kurz. Fulgrim and the Emperor's children, constant pursuit of perfection, was starting to morally erode the Legion from within. The civil war that would bring the Imperium to a grinding halt and usher in the true Age of Darkness would be referred to as the Horus Heresy, named after Horus Lupercal, the War Master. But in reality, Horus was not the cause of the great betrayal that was the heresy. He was its face, its representative. It was in fact another Primarch that the heresy should be named after, and that Primarch was Logar Aurelian, Primarch of the Word-Bearers Legion. All crusades are pushed forward by ideologies, a new paradigm being fought into the world, a setting for new beliefs and perspectives to exist, and hopefully a better world. The ideology of the Great Crusade was the imperial truth. The imperial truth was a rational, materialistic, and secular belief system that disregarded the existence of anything supernatural or that beyond human understanding, the reason, and the sciences. It did away with the old religions, the old gods, and the old faiths of the Age of Terra, or at least did away with their supernatural significance and practices, as some of their symbology could still be used in a secular way. The Emperor created the imperial truth during the Unification Wars as its driving paradigm. He used the imperial truth to drag Terra out of the darkness of the old night into a new age of progress and enlightenment similar to the Age of Technology. Though all of the Emperor's forces fought under the influence of the imperial truth, one of the legions he had created had been spreading the imperial truth as their primary focus, and this was the 17th Legion. Called the Iconoclasts and the Imperial Heralds, they were the destroyers of the old world and the bringers of the new. They were extremely serious about the spread of the imperial truth across Terra. Somewhat ironically, during the scattering of the Primarchs, their Primarch Logar Aurelian landed on the world of Cultus, a world whose population was not only super religious, but who unknowingly worshipped the Chaos Gods. The thing about the imperial truth was that it was a lie. The supernatural did exist in the universe. There were gods and spirits and beings in the warp. The Emperor knew this. He has, in his immortal lifetime, encountered them many times and even bargained with them in order to create the Primarchs. But the Emperor knew that if humanity believed in these things, that belief would only empower the Chaos Gods and give them more sway over humanity. So, he created a belief system for humanity to have, which took power away from the Chaos Gods through disbelief in them. Because he grew up on Cultus, the Primarch Logar knew the truth already, that gods did exist. In his world's belief system, the Chaos Gods were prophets, and because of this, they didn't appear like how they did in other parts of the galaxy. Where they appeared demonic in other places, on Cultus they were looked at as like pagan gods of nature. And an important part of the religious path of Cultus was to journey to the Empyrean, which was what they called the Warp. If you'd like to understand more about Logar and the world he landed on, I suggest my Primarch video on him. I think it's my least watched Primarch video, but to be honest, I think it's one of my most interesting videos. For this video, what you need to know is that while on Cultus and fighting the religious wars of his world, Logar created a new religion centered around a figure called the One. The One was the Emperor, a god that resided over the other gods. He even had a vision of the Emperor arriving to Cultus before he did, and based his religion on the Emperor's arrival. This is important because when the Emperor arrived as predicted, this only reinforced Logar's belief in the Emperor as a god. Though the Emperor stated adamantly that he was not a god, Logar was so hardwired to believe in some sort of divinity that his line of thinking was, only a god would say that they're not a god. Logar was able to drop the topic in the presence of the Emperor, but he couldn't stop believing in the Emperor as a god. So when Logar was given leadership of the 17th Legion, his legion, he would slowly change their secular zealotry into religious zealotry, centering around the worship of the Emperor as a god. As Logar went about prosecuting the Great Crusade, it wouldn't be the imperial truth that he would be spreading, but the teachings of his own writing, the Lectitio Divinatis, the imperial cult, and the worship of the Emperor as a god. Because Logar and his legion spread the imperial cult, they would often linger on worlds that they subjugated, building churches and monasteries to the Emperor of Mankind and leading religious observances. This meant that they would go about the Great Crusade way slower than the other legions. Their slowness was what caught the attention of the Emperor, who sent emissaries to figure out what was going on with the word bearers. And when he found out, he was furious. The Emperor had the Primarch Rabute Guilliman and his legion, the Ultramarines, destroy Monarchia, the word bearer's perfect city, and the Emperor himself psychically forced Logar and his entire legion to kneel before him. The Emperor commanded Logar to snap out of this delusion of godhood that he had toward the Emperor. This had a profound impact on Logar, the shame, the guilt of it all. He immediately stopped believing in the Emperor as a god. But because he was so hardwired to believe in the divine, he actually regressed in his beliefs back to the teachings of cultus and the belief in the gods. This was the true beginning of the heresy. The scorned Logar would continue the Great Crusade with a new energy and drive, his expeditionary fleets moving faster than ever before. But now it was no longer the imperial cult that Logar was spreading, but the worship of the Chaos Gods. Logar would embark upon Cultus's pilgrimage to the Empyrean by entering the warp through the Eye of Terror and communicating with the Chaos Gods themselves. When he emerged from the warp, he was no longer a Primarch of the Emperor, but a champion of Chaos Undivided, and his legion would loyally follow him down the path to damnation. Not only did heresy through the imperial cult spread throughout the populations of humanity rediscovered during the Crusade, but heresy also spread through the legions. After the first joint operation between the Lunawolves and the Word Bearers on the subjugation of the planet Davin, secret orders began to spread throughout some of the Space Marine legions. These orders were called warrior lodges. These informal fraternities allowed open communication and disregarded rank amongst Astartes, which eroded legion structure and discipline. Soon, loyalties in some legions became more and more personal to each other and to their Primarch over the Imperium and the Emperor. Though Horus did have a part to play in the heresy, it was Logar and the Word Bearer's Legion that would begin the heresy. Horus Lupercal, War Master of the Imperium, was ambitious, he was aggressive, and he was competitive. This is what we know of him and what was commonly spoken of him. But another aspect of his personality that was not so emphasized was his open-mindedness. Horus Lupercal was curious about the factions of humanity that survived the Old Night, and while it was his duty to incorporate them into the greater Imperium or otherwise destroy them, he was far more flexible than other Primarchs in regards to these civilizations keeping some aspects of their own cultures. This is what would lead to Horus Lupercal and his legion, which were newly named the Sons of Horus after the triumph of Ulanor, meeting with the Interrex, which were a human-Xenos hybrid civilization that had survived the Old Night and were technologically as well as spiritually advanced. Horus was there to talk peace and to negotiate their incorporation into the Imperium, but an emissary of the Word Bearer's Legion, whose name was Erebus, would secretly steal a chaos-infused blade from the Interrex's guarded armory. When alarms started blaring, the Interrex accused Horus of attempting sabotage, and despite Horus insisting that he did no such thing, so dangerous was the weapon that was stolen, and so serious was the threat that it posed, that the Interrex was not hearing it. They fell upon Horus and his legion, attempting to assassinate the Primarch. Horus was able to escape from this situation, but in his wrath he declared the extermination of the entire Interrex species and all of their star systems. The same Chaos Blade that was stolen from the Interrex would be used against Horus. As mentioned earlier, Horus and his legion would go on campaign on the world of Davin alongside the Word Bearers. When the world's tribal population was subjugated, Horus left one of his most trusted imperial administrators to bring the Davinite population into the fold of the Imperium. However, after the Interrex situation, he was informed that the administrator that he had left in charge of that reincorporation had turned his back to the Imperium. Now this was a lie, this was a trap, this was a ploy by the Word Bearers Legion to get Horus to go to Davin. Horus and his legion made full haste to Davin to find a world completely changed from what it was before. It was full of swamps and decay. While exploring the world, the legion would come under attack by the zombie-like people of Davin, and in the process, Horus Lupercal was stabbed with the Chaos Blade that had been taken from the Interrex by the Chaos-corrupted administrator that he had appointed. Being a Primarch, Horus would have normally recovered from such a wound, but this wound would not heal, and it terrified his legion. Horus would fall into a death-like coma, and no apothecary could figure out what the issue was. Finally, the Warrior Lodge members of the Sons of Horus were encouraged to take Horus to the Serpent Lodge cult of Davin, and they would use their quote-unquote abilities to heal the Primarch. Well, the Serpent Lodge was a chaos cult, and when the Sons of Horus took their Primarch to the cult, the priests of the Serpent Lodge used sorcery, and they gave visions to Horus Lupercal in his coma-like state that would convince him that the Emperor would eventually discard the Primarchs, and that it was the Emperor's goal to become a god, that he was using everyone around him for that specific purpose. Interestingly enough, Magnus, Primarch of the Thousand Sons, was present in this vision. He had been astral projecting and found himself witnessing Horus being lied to. Magnus actually tried to stop Horus from believing what was being said to him, but by that time, it was too late. Horus had made up his mind. He would defeat the Emperor for his lies and manipulation. Horus would wake from his unconsciousness, much to the relief and thankfulness of his legion. But when he awoke, he was different. Horus Lupercal had been fully corrupted by the forces of chaos, and he planned to destroy the Imperium and the Emperor. Though all the Primarchs have certain warp-based abilities, with them being partially created from the warp, Magnus, Primarch of the Thousand Sons Legion, was the only true psychic Primarch, and an extremely powerful one at that. The problem was that ever since he learned the limitations of his own abilities while on the planet of Prospero, he has been manipulated by the Chaos God Tzeentch onto the path of sorcery, and sorcery is forbidden in the Imperium. I know that might sound contradictory, but there is a difference between having psychic powers and practicing sorcery. In the Warhammer 40k universe, to be a psychic or to have psychic powers is the result of a genetic mutation, whereas to practice sorcery is to enter deals with the entities of the warp. We could use the Emperor as an example. The Emperor of Mankind was physically, genetically a psyker, but he practiced sorcery in order to make the Primarchs. Magnus was a genetically psyker Primarch who was misguided into practicing sorcery. As the Great Crusade progressed, Magnus's desire for occult knowledge would repeatedly put him at odds with his brother Primarchs. His legion, most of whom were also genetically psykers, followed him down the path of occult knowledge. Eventually, the Emperor became uncertain about the role of psykers in the legions, and he called the Council of Nicaea, which was an opportunity for the legions to argue for or against the use of psykers in the legions. In truth, though, the Council of Nicaea was actually the trial of Magnus for practicing sorcery. At the Council of Nicaea, or the trial of Magnus, Magnus would deliver a passionate speech about the knowledge and power of using one's psychic sorcery for the Imperium. But in the end, the Emperor declared the removal of psykers from the battle line of the legions, and he also forbid Magnus to continue his path down occult knowledge, with the threat of destruction if he did not comply. Important to note here was the large presence of the Space Wolves Legion at the Council of Nicaea. The Space Wolves and their Primarch Leman Russ were the most loyal and trusted of all Astartes legions, one highly favored and utilized personally by the Emperor. The Space Wolves had gained a reputation as the Emperor's executioners, not only because of the actions that they performed during the early Great Crusade, but because of their involvement in the fate of the missing legions, which they had a part in destroying. Having the Space Wolves there was both a precaution, a threat, and a foreboding of things to come all at once. Magnus was devastated, but he complied with the Emperor at the location of the trial. However, as soon as he got back to Prospero, he and his legion would continue to practice sorcery and use their psychic powers in secret. One day, Magnus was astral projecting, meaning that he was projecting his spiritual self through the warp, when he found himself witnessing Horus Lupercal being told about the Emperor's quote-unquote true goals. Magnus tried his best to warn Horus that he was being deceived, but it was basically too late. Returning to himself from his projection, Magnus knew he had to do something quick to warn the Emperor. And so, despite being warned to stop using sorcery, Magnus would astral project himself to Terra to warn the Emperor directly. On his journey to Terra through the warp, he discovered the Webway. Tzeentch, the Chaos God of Change, would help him break an opening into the Webway so that he could make it to Terra even faster. But by doing so, he allowed the warp to spill into the Webway and corrupt it. When Magnus did finally make it to Terra through astral projection, he would emerge from the Webway right next to the Golden Throne, which had wards and protections to prevent anything from the Webway emerging out of it. Not only was the Emperor's secret project revealed to one of the Primarchs, but this Primarch basically gave the forces of chaos a direct route to the epicenter of the Imperium of Man, the Imperial Palace itself. The Emperor considered this the ultimate betrayal by Magnus. Magnus tried to warn the Emperor about what was going on with Horus Lupercal, but the Emperor, who was enraged, banished him back to his body on Prospero. After this, the Emperor turned to Leman Russ, Primarch of the Space Wolves. First, the Emperor commanded Russ to send out specialized squads of Space Wolves to each of the legions so that they could keep an eye on the Primarchs for signs of betrayal, because if Magnus could betray, then the others could as well. If deemed necessary, these squads of Space Wolves had permission to kill the Primarchs who showed signs of betrayal. He also instructed Leman Russ and his legion to go to Prospero and to arrest Magnus and bring him to Terra. After this, the Emperor returned his attention to the Golden Throne. However, on the route to Prospero, Horus Lupercal would distort the message of the Emperor and convince Leman Russ to instead destroy Magnus and the Thousand Sons instead of simply arrest them. The Space Wolves Legion, along with elements of the Custodes and the Sisters of Silence, traveled to Prospero, homeworld of the Thousand Sons Legion. What followed was the absolute slaughter of the Prosperan population and the near decimation of the Thousand Sons Legion by the Space Wolves. Magnus could have warned his legion about what was going to happen. He knew it was going to happen. The Emperor told him. But so overcome with guilt was he that he initially didn't do anything as the wolves fell upon his world. Only at seeing at how devastating the attack was did he finally join his legion in combat. This brought him face to face with Leman Russ, the Wolf King, who was a far better fighter than Magnus, and who consequently ended up lifting Magnus off the ground and breaking Magnus's back on his knee. Broken not only mentally but physically, Magnus would retreat into the warp along with those remaining legionnaires of his legion. Horus Lupercal was the perfect Primarch to convince betrayal against the Emperor because he was the War Master. And the reason why he was the War Master was because he knew the strengths of the Imperial forces, he knew the strengths of the other Primarchs and their legions. He also knew their weaknesses. Knowing the strengths and weaknesses of his brother Primarchs, Horus determined which brothers would be on his side versus which would be against him. Some of the Primarchs that joined Horus joined because of a personal slight they had received from the Emperor. Logar and the Wordbearers sided with Horus primarily because of the humiliation the Emperor subjected them to for them worshipping him as a god. Angron readily joined Horus, still angry at the Emperor for taking him away from his fate on Nuceria when he was discovered. Some Primarchs, like Fulgrim, joined out of weakness. Fulgrim's weakness was the pursuit of perfection, which was psychically amplified by a Chaos Blade that he had discovered. Others joined Horus out of desperation. Mortarion fell to Chaos to save his legion from being completely destroyed by the power of Nurgle. Both Perturabo and Conrad Kurz would deploy their legions on their own homeworlds due to their populations resorting back to old and treacherous ways. Though their actions were out of loyalty to the Imperium, they both felt very strongly that the Emperor would not understand or accept their reasoning, and so they sided with Horus. By the end of it all, a full half of the Primarchs had sided with Horus Lupercal and his plans for betrayal, which meant that the rest were problems that Horus had to deal with. Because the Loyalist legions and their Primarchs didn't know that Horus had been corrupted when he was, they still respected his authority as War Master. So when he sent them to fight conflicts that were far from Terra, they didn't question it. But these deployments were traps to either destroy those legions, force them to his side, or at the very minimum, keep them as far away from Terra as possible, so that when the traitors attacked the solar system, these legions wouldn't be able to reinforce the others that were defending Terra. For example, Horus sent the Blood Angels to the Cygnus cluster, specifically Cygnus Prime, in order to face a made-up enemy that for some reason required the entire legion to destroy. In reality, the Cygnus cluster was a realm of chaos, and Horus sent Sanguinius and the Blood Angels there because Horus found out about the Red Thirst, the flaw of the Blood Angels. He was counting on the Blood Angels falling to chaos through the Red Thirst and joining the traitor's side, with Sanguinius becoming a champion of the chaos god Khorne. A lot of Blood Angels died in this trap, and Sanguinius himself was knocked out by the demon Kabanda, which in turn forced the entire Blood Angels Legion into the Black Rage, which is a second flaw. But unfortunately for Horus, Sanguinius and the Blood Angels survived the trap and remained loyal to the Emperor. Another example is that Horus sent the Ultramarines to Calth, and that was a trap as well, where the Wordbearers could get their revenge on the Ultramarines for what happened on Monarchia. This led to the Ultramarines fighting the Wordbearers in a Zone Mortalis style arena of battle under the surface of Calth. The Wordbearers even created a warp storm called the Ruin Storm, which interfered with communication outside of it and stopped any sort of travel outside the eastern fringes. The Wordbearers were forced to retreat when the Ultramarines' fleet reinforcements broke through their blockade. There was an assassination attempt on Guilliman's life by the Alpha Legion, who were masquerading as Ultramarines, and soon after the events on Calth, the Ultramarines hunted the World Eaters and Word Bearers to Nuceria, where Angron became a demon Primarch. Jagatai Khan and the White Scars had previously been sent to the Chandak system to fight orcs, so they were pretty much unaware of the betrayal, but when they did become aware of it, it was through the news about the burning of Prospero. However, it was framed as if the Space Wolves were in the wrong and had lost self-control. Horus actually commanded the Khan and his legion to fight the Space Wolves. Thankfully, Jagatai Khan was a thinker and didn't make any decisions or actions that he was unsure of. Horus could never tell Lionel Johnson what to do. No one could, except for the Emperor. Horus knew that the Lion and the Dark Angels were a serious threat to his plans, and so Conrad Kurz and his Night Lords began to commit murders on the population of Imperial-held worlds, which caught the ear of Lionel Johnson. The Lion and his legion would end up hunting the Night Haunter and his legion, which turned into the Thramis Crusade. While these loyalist legions were engaged in the orchestration of Horus Lupercal, the traitors needed to clean house basically. Each of the betrayal legions had to get rid of the loyalist elements of their own legions. This would lead to a battle known as the Isfan III Atrocity. where the Death Guard, the Emperor's children, the Sons of Horus, and the World Eaters would use a battle on Ispan 3 as a cover-up for their nefarious plans. Each of these legions would send the Marines that they knew were loyal to the Emperor to the surface of Ispan 3 to fight the Ispan population. Once they were all deployed, the ships of the Death Guard Legion would hover over the planet and drop Life Eater virus bombs onto the world, which practically melted the Marines who couldn't make it to some sort of sealed shelter. The majority of the Loyalists were killed in this initial attack, but seeing that there were some survivors, the traitor elements descended onto the planet to finish the job. If all of the Loyalists from the traitor legions had have been killed on Ispan 3, the Horus Heresy might have ended completely differently, but a mixed group of Loyalist Marines from those legions was able to escape the planet at the expense of the lives of those who fought to buy them time. They were able to acquire a small ship, the Eisenstein, and they were able to exit the system. This ship would be discovered by Rogol Dorn and the Imperial Fists, and it was in this way that the shocked Loyalist legions became aware of what was happening. Soon after, the Emperor would find out, and the Civil War would truly begin. When Rogol Dorn commanded 7 legions to head to Istvan in order to subjugate the 4 traitor legions, he didn't know that 4 of the 7 legions he commanded to Istvan were already traitors. The Salamanders, Raven Guard, and Iron Hand legions, all led by their Primarchs and all loyal, deployed onto Istvan 5 to face the traitors as part of the first wave of attack. The second wave of attack, composed of the Iron Warriors, the Alpha Legion, the Word Bearers, and the Night Lords. When the second wave of attack made it to Ispan 5, and the legions that had been fighting would retreat from the front lines in order to recover, those 4 legions, the Iron Warriors, the Alpha Legion, the Word Bearers, and the Night Lords, would open fire on the Salamanders, the Raven Guard, and the Iron Hands. It was horrible. Caught in the middle of traitors, thousands of Loyalists were gunned down in crossfire from both sides of the battlefield. The Iron Warriors even dropped a tactical nuclear bomb on the Loyalists that nearly killed Vulcan. Enraged, Ferrus Manus, Primarch of the Iron Hands Legion, would confront and face his once favored brother Fulgrim, who, to the shock of everyone present, decapitated and killed Ferrus Manus. A Primarch had been killed, a patriarch, a man of gold, killed by his own brother in fratricide. This just took things to another level. In order to survive, the Loyalists had to retreat from the Istvan system or else completely be wiped out. Istvan 5 was not only a massacre but an open act of rebellion for all to see and know. There could be no mistaking it. Horus and half of the Primarchs were now enemies of the Imperium. With the elements of surprise taken from the traitors and the Imperial Fists actively fortifying not only the Imperial Palace but the entire solar system, there was a race to Terra by both Loyalists and traitors. The ruin storm that the Word Bearers had created still raged and prevented communication or warp travel outside the realm of Ultramar. So the Ultramarines, Blood Angels, and Dark Angels consolidated their legions to Macragge to wait for a break in the warp storms in order to head to Terra. But without any communication possible, those legions and the Primarchs feared the worst. So Guilliman decided to create the Imperium Secundus, kind of like a second epicenter of the Imperium for all of the forces to the east of Terra. In the event that Terra already fell to the traitors, the Imperium would need another focal point and another ruling body. Guilliman made Macragge that secondary focal point, and he made himself, Lionel Johnson, and Sanguinius the ruling body of that focal point, with Sanguinius serving as the emperor of the Second Imperium. This idea was good on paper, but it did not work out well in real life. Each of the 3 Primarchs had been changed by the betrayal so far. Gilliman was shot up at point-blank range by a squad of Alpha Legionnaires masquerading as Ultramarines. Lionel Johnson trusted no one and was willing to kill everyone around him at all times, and Sanguinius began having visions of his own death at the hands of Horus Lupercal. Everyone was traumatized, everyone was on edge, so they clashed a lot. And when Konrad Curze began lurking around Ultramar, the Lion wasn't having it and disregarded any sense of cooperation with his brothers. And speaking of brothers, Vulcan found out that he was a perpetual on Istvan V when the nuclear bomb sent by the Iron Warriors didn't erase him from existence. But do you know who also found out that Vulcan was a perpetual? Konrad Curze, who proceeded to kidnap, torture, and kill Vulcan over and over and over again in a variety of ways, so many times that Vulcan began losing his mind. Curze really was doing the most, but somehow Vulcan escaped from Curze's torture chamber. Konrad Curze had basically created a maze that had no way out and had different forms of murder at every turn. At the center of the maze was Vulcan's Warhammer, which Curze put there as a kind of incentive for Vulcan. Vulcan would eventually make it to his hammer, and what Curze didn't know was that there was a teleportation device in the hammer, which Vulcan activated. Vulcan disappeared off of the ship and reappeared in space, right above Macragge, falling. Vulcan proceeded to fall through the atmosphere of Macragge and burn to a crisp. But it's okay though, because he would return later. So eventually, the Imperium Secundus dissolved. The brother Primarchs were clashing too much. Everyone just waited for the warp storms to part until they couldn't wait anymore and decided to attempt at warp jumping to Terra. These attempts were unsuccessful, but they did lead to Sanguinius learning that Davin, the location where Horus was corrupted, was the key to stopping the Ruin Storm. So all three legions headed to Davin, and there was this hardcore demonic activity going on around Davin, like demon ships literally eating other ships demonic. But in the end, Davin was bombed from orbit, and once it was destroyed, a path was shown through the warp storm. While the Ultramarines and the Dark Angels fought off the remaining Chaos forces, the Blood Angels fleet moved through the Ruin Storm, making it to Terra and the solar system. Jagatai Khan and the White Scars had gained access to the webway and used it to bypass the Ruin Storm in order to get to Terra, so they arrived to the Sol system as well. So now we have three legions, the Imperial Fists, the Blood Angels, and the White Scars in the Sol system preparing for the siege. But everyone else was having a hard time. Those loyalist legions that had suffered during the dropsite massacre of Istvan V had elements of their legions form into Black Shield warbands and began a guerrilla war against the traitors, sabotaging them at every turn they could. The Iron Hands lost their Primarch and lost their sanity over it, becoming bitter and delusional with grief and ideas of weakness. Though they remained loyal, they returned to Medusa and basically didn't participate in the Heresy after that. The Raven Guard had extremely low numbers and tried to boost them, which led to the creation of the Raptors, which were basically the Horus Heresy version of Primaris Marines. But that was sabotaged by the Alpha Legion and corrupted, so the Raven Guard were basically out of the fight. The Salamanders didn't even know if their Primarch was alive or not, so they basically fought as part of the Shattered Legion's warbands. The Space Wolves couldn't make it to Terra because they were being attacked repeatedly by the Alpha Legion. The Ultramarines and the Dark Angels were still fighting the blockade, though some Dark Angels were able to go through the pathway to Terra. And that's just the Space Marine legions. The rest of the Imperium was going through it. Billions of regular soldiers were dying every single day. Worlds were being destroyed, planets were being blown up, the Titan legions, the god machines were turning places into death worlds that will never be habitable again in their fights against each other. The Mechanicus also was having their own battle against the Dark Mechanicus. It literally might as well have been the Cybernetic Revolt Part 2. And some of you might be asking, why didn't the Emperor just take the Custodes and kill all the traitors? Well, remember when Magnus broke the Webway project that led directly into the Imperial Palace? When he entered the webway, he allowed the warp to seep into it as well, which gave all the demons in the warp access to the Imperial Palace. So the Emperor and his custodies were fighting their own battle, the war in the webway, for years while all of this was happening outside the solar system. The Emperor would even have to sit on the Golden Throne to keep the project from collapsing in on itself. Eventually, the Emperor would have to use all of the psychers available near the solar system in order to power the Golden Throne, and he would summon Vulcan to Terra in order to create a doomsday device just in case things went left. So Vulcan, who was recently reborn, arrived to Terra to help. So 3 legions and 4 Primarchs in the Sol system, with the traitors closing in. The Primarch Rogal Dorn was made commander of the Loyalist forces in the Sol system while the Emperor handled the webway. What Dorn decided to do was divide the naval defenses of the solar system into 5 spheres of protection around key locations in the solar system, and he would have captains and commanders of his legion overseeing each of the spheres. The first sphere was the outermost layer of protection, and it was around Pluto. The second sphere surrounded Uranus, the third sphere was around Jupiter, the fourth sphere was around Mars, and the fifth sphere was around Terra. Now, if you remember from part 1 of this video, each of these planets are super important to the Loyalist side. Plus, Mars had been overtaken by the Dark Mechanicum forces, and because of that, the fourth sphere was the second largest sphere and the most active, even before the Siege of Terra, because the Dark Mechanicum were trying to break through the sphere in order to attack Terra. It would be the Alpha Legion that would begin the assault on the solar system by causing widespread rebellions and cult uprising, by infiltrating key locations and blowing up ships in order to distract Rogal Dorn. Dorn was not used to this kind of subterfuge-style warfare, but with the help of his Huscarl, Archimus, he was able to see through the scheme and meet Alpharius on Pluto, killing him before returning to Terra, making Alpharius the second Loyalist Primarch to be killed. And if you're curious as to why I say he was loyal, I recommend my Primarch video on Alpharius Omegon. After that, Rogal Dorn pulled back all Astartes' forces to Terra except for those commanding the spheres and analyzed the progress of battle from the Imperial Palace. There were 2 warp gates in the Sol system that the traitors tried to seize control of. With this, the Solar War truly began, as the traitor legion's fleets began to circle and then head into the solar system. This was the largest fleet-based conflict that the solar system ever had to fight, and this initial battle was fought between the humans of the Imperial Navy on the Loyalist side against Space Marines, demons, and demonic engines on the traitor side. It was the Sons of Horus and the Iron Warriors that did most of the heavy lifting during the Solar War. One by one, each of the spheres was broken, with the first sphere being taken by the Sons of Horus and the second sphere by the Iron Warriors, while the rest were a combined effort. Just like how the Emperor put Rogal Dorn in charge of fortifying the Sol system, Horus put Perturabo in charge of sieging it. A decisive strike by the traitors was when the rest of the traitor fleet that had been circling the solar system entered in large numbers between the Moon and Mars before dividing and attacking the fourth sphere, which was around Mars. Being attacked from outside the sphere by the traitor legions and inside the sphere by the Dark Mechanicum, it couldn't hold and it fell. With the last sphere before Terra being destroyed, Horus Lupercal had a direct path toward Terra itself, which began the Siege of Terra. First began the orbital bombardments. The traitor fleets basically unleashed their broadside cannons onto Terra and specifically the Imperial Palace. This would have been devastating except for the fact that the Imperial Palace had extremely powerful void shields and cannon retaliation systems. But it was Perturabo overseeing the bombardments, so eventually he found a weakness that allowed aircraft access to more of the Imperial grounds, and so Perturabo sent large amounts of cultists to distract the Loyalists from their other plans. The Death Guard were officially the first traitor Astartes Legion to land on Terra and begin assaulting the Imperial Palace. Mortarion and his Death Guard were fought against by Jagatai Khan and the White Scars. Using a combination of demonic shenanigans and low-orbit void ships, the traitors were able to deploy siege engines and titans onto Terra, and the Night Lords, leaderless as they were, joined the fight by attacking the Eternity Gate. Sanguinius led a force of Imperial Fists, Blood Angels, and Titans to buy time for the Imperial conscripts, who were absolutely terrified, to make it inside the walls of the palace. The Loyalist defenses had been peeled away like the layers of an onion, and forces continued to move inward toward the Imperial Palace. By the time the siege of the Imperial Palace was in full swing, nearly all of the traitor legions had landed onto Terra along with their Primarchs, the Sons of Horus, the Night Lords, the Death Guard, the Thousand Sons, the Iron Warriors, the Word Bearers, the World Eaters, and the Alpha Legion, along with millions of cultists and even demonic entities, fought against the Imperial Fists, the Blood Angels, the White Scars, the Dark Angels, and millions of Imperial militia. It was basically the apocalypse. It was the end of the world, and the Loyalists were holding but losing. Rogaldorn was doing as much as he could to buy time for the other Loyalist legions like the Ultramarines or even the Space Wolves to arrive, but the traitors were gaining ground quickly. Key locations around the Imperial Palace like the Lion's Gate and Eternity Wall spaceports were being seized by the Sons of Horus. Magnus and his Thousand Sons breached the Imperial Palace for a second time. The Dark Angels fought against the Death Guard in defense of the Astronomicon. In all of this chaos, something would happen that would begin to turn the tide. The Iron Warriors Legion abandoned the siege of Terra. It was at the command of their Primarch, Perturabo, who took a moment to look around and see all of the demons and warp entities being used in the siege. It was insulting to him that the traitor efforts weren't enough by themselves, that they needed demonic assistance, so he commanded his legion to retreat back to their ships. This is important because, as said before, Horus pretty much left Perturabo in charge of the siege. With him gone, it would be an inconvenience, but Horus himself would rise to command once more, and he would use Titan legions to fill the gap that the 4th Legion had once occupied. After spending damn near the entire siege in isolation, Horus emerged and ordered the Void Shields on his ship, the Vengeful Spirit, to be lowered as a challenge to the Emperor, a challenge that the Emperor would accept. Malcador would take the Emperor's place on the Golden Throne in order to maintain it for as long as possible. Knowing that he wouldn't survive the throne for long, the Emperor declared Malcador the Sigillite to be Malcador the Hero. Together, the Emperor, Constantin Valdor and his Custodes, Sanguinius and his Guard, and Rogaldorn and his Huscarls all teleported onto the Vengeful Spirit and were scattered throughout the ship. Only Sanguinius ended up where he intended to be, which was on the bridge of the ship where Horus was located. Horus would try to convince Sanguinius to join the side of Chaos, but the angel would refuse and would attack Horus. Sanguinius knew that he was going to die in this combat, but still, he fought Horus as if he could somehow defy that fate. He fought desperately, but still, his fate would come to pass and Horus would brutally murder Sanguinius. As a result, all blood angels everywhere descended into the Black Rage instantaneously, tearing apart everyone around them. Next, the Emperor made it to the bridge and fought Horus. Horus Lupercal was significantly stronger than the Emperor at this point, being supercharged with chaos. The Emperor couldn't beat him physically or metaphysically, so the Emperor resorted to trickery and guile. After an epic battle between the two, the Emperor would win the combat against Horus Lupercal, obliterating him with his psychic power. But the Emperor himself would be gravely wounded, left barely alive by the fight. Dorn and Valdor would find the Emperor and bring him back to the Imperial Palace. When Horus Lupercal died, the traitor legions made a full about-face and retreated. Chaos itself had abandoned the conflict, with the warp entities evaporating into thin air, and the betrayer legions began making a fighting retreat. No longer held back by the Ruin Storm, the Ultramarines and the Dark Angels began hunting the traitor legions in a period of time known as the Great Scouring. This pursuit would lead to most of the traitor legions being chased into the realm of chaos itself, through the Eye of Terror. Despite the amount of things that happened during it, the Horus Heresy only lasted for about 7 or 8 years. It began around 005 M31 and ended in 014 M31, but the effect that it had on the 40k universe was similar to the end of the Dark Age of technology. Progress stopped as the Imperium picked up the pieces after a civil war that had set the galaxy ablaze. Though the Emperor was still considered the ruler of the Imperium, at the end of the Horus Heresy he was left mostly dead by his fight against Horus, and what remained of his body was placed upon the Golden Throne so that his psychic powers could keep the machine operational. But for all intent and purpose, the Emperor was dead and the Webway project was destroyed. The Administratum, also known as the High Lords of Terra, took over leadership of the Imperium, with representatives from almost all organizations in the Imperium within it. There was a generalized distrust of Space Marines, even from amongst the Space Marines. Rabute Gilman would break up the remaining Loyalist legions so that one person would never hold the power of an entire legion as before. The original legions would be formed into the first founding chapters, and the other chapters made from them would be known as successor chapters of the second founding. Each would be led by a chapter master and adhere as close as possible to the Codex Astartes, which was written by Rabute Gilman. This transition from legions to chapters was not so readily accepted, with Rogel Dorn being strongly opposed to it and nearly causing another civil war. But in the end, Dorn relented, and together the Loyalist forces conducted the scouring, the hunting of the traitors, into the Eye of Terror. The Imperium was extremely weakened by the heresy. Untold billions of its citizens had died, technological progress had halted, and the dream of the Great Crusade was no more. The age that follows the Age of Darkness is officially called the Age of the Imperium, and there are many important stories to be told about it before we reach the current settings of the 40k universe. But, for the purpose of this video, that was the Horus Heresy in a nutshell. If you enjoyed this video and you haven't done so already, please like and subscribe for more content. If you think I did a decent job in explaining the Horus Heresy, please share this video with your hobby friends, as it helps the channel grow and I would appreciate it. Without anything else to say, Inquisitor Vaughn out. Remember, the Emperor protects and the future is successor.